Answering that question, it kept coming up, I kept trying to avoid it. Now is my opportunity to talk directly about that matter. And of course there's actually two questions here. There's the question about the ethics of robotic weapons that we've heard a fair amount about already, and there's the question of accepting money from the military. And I want to say a bit about both of those. I want to begin by conceding that it does seem to me that robotic weapons do have some advantages over alternative systems. I mean, it's very easy to get upset about killing at a distance, about the difficulties of discrimination with these systems. How we feel about a weapon system should be shaped at least in part by the alternatives. If you think about area bombing or long-range artillery shelling from a naval boat, robotic weapons actually look pretty good in some dimensions. At least. They will save lives of the soldiers who otherwise would have been sent into combat, and that matters. And I do think there's some case that there's, as was argued in the last presentation, that they may be capable of being more discriminating in particular contexts, not in counterinsurgency warfare, but perhaps in air-to-air combat, or perhaps in undersea warfare. Autonomous systems may indeed have significant advantages. Despite that, I think the problems related to the threshold of conflict are really profound. And this is not just an issue with autonomous weapons, but even the teleoperated, the remote-controlled weapons, make it much easier for governments to decide to go to war. It's the kind of standard foreign policy question now is something bad is happening in North Africa. People we don't like are taking control of something. What should we do? Well, the American public is really sick of going to war. Let's send in the drones. Let's kill a few of the people who are suddenly identified with Al-Qaeda. And before we know it, people with dark skins in Africa are being killed by robotic weapons sent by a nation where the military-industrial complex is overwhelmingly white. I do think it is worth keeping in mind here that there is a kind of race history to robotic weapons that people don't pay much attention to. It is overwhelmingly people with dark skins being killed by these weapons. I think we should pay some attention to that. So the threshold of conflict issues seem to me really quite important, that it makes it too easy for governments to go to war. In the future, if we begin to see American autonomous submarines hunting Chinese autonomous submarines in the Pacific, there'll be a real risk of accidental warfare. And those concerns about the threshold of conflict suggest to me that robotic weapons research is something that we should be thinking very seriously about, particularly as the need for these weapons is something that I want to call into question in a moment. Another thing that I think is happening with robotic weapons research is the kind of failure of the promise of robotics as well. I'll just mention this in passing. It's just so depressing to see so many bright, talented people working on a project that is dedicated to killing people. And of all the problems that we face today, defensive threats actually, I think, are pretty, well, the threat of attack is actually pretty low on the list for most of the countries developing these weapons. So let me say a little bit now about the ethics of accepting military funding, and I think we need to talk about war for a moment. And another thing that's sort of strange about the particular history of the development of robotic weapons is that they're overwhelmingly being developed by countries who have very little, where the civilian populations have very little recent experience of war. War's a very abstract thing for most people in the United States. That these are weapon systems that unleash a destructive power that the civilian populations who are in the nations developing them have often forgotten about it. So there are kind of, if you're not going to be a total war theorist, so total war theorists are people who think that anything goes in war. If you're not going to be a total war theorist, there are a couple of critical positions that we might take towards war. One, of course, is pacifism. War's never justified. It's pretty hard to, I have a lot of sympathy, particularly for a political pacifism, which accepts the right to use force in defence of yourself, but argues that when nations go to war, they're hardly ever defending the individual citizens. They're overwhelmingly defending political conceptions that we may not think it's worth killing people about. Most people aren't going to buy a pacifist argument. Most people here, I think, are going to be in the just war tradition that accepts that wars are justified under certain circumstances, and the just war tradition's a pretty powerful philosophical tradition. One of the things that people don't recognise about the just war tradition is that it implies that less than 50% of wars are justified, which means that if you're working in the defence forces, chances are that you're going to be fighting an unjust, supporting a government fighting an unjust conflict. I'm not saying any particular government is always fighting unjust conflicts, but we've got to accept that some wars are justified on neither side, and most wars will only be justified on one side. So just a sort of straight statistical analysis suggests that if you're working for the military, chances are you're working for a military that will be fighting actually for an unjust cause rather than a just cause. So the just war tradition, even though it accepts that some wars are justified, is much more anti-war than people recognise. Most people think, oh, of course, we're always fighting in a just cause. But if you look at all the people around the world saying that, they can't all be right. There's a more radical critique of the military that actually thinks that the purpose of the military is not about fighting wars at all, but actually about suppressing the civilian population at home. And if we look at events in Egypt at the moment, or Thailand, both of which countries have had military coups in the last year or so, actually there's a lot of evidence that what the military is really doing is working to suppress its own population. Of course, if you accept that critique, that makes accepting military funding very problematic. So I think engineers need to be thinking seriously both about war in general, but also about the particular wars in which robotic weapons have come of age. And there's been two periods in the history of engineering where there have been vigorous debates within the engineering profession about the ethics of working for the military or accepting military funding. One was when people realised that nuclear weapons had been developed essentially to deter the Soviet Union, that they weren't being used to defend against fascism, or developed to defend against fascism. So post-World War II, there's a period where the ethics of working on nuclear weapons becomes controversial. And of course, after the Vietnam War, there's a big period where people worry about accepting military funding. I think it's worth keeping in mind that the contemporary enthusiasm for robotic weapons developed in the context of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And the judgment of history is not going to be kind to US participation in those wars. Most people nowadays see those wars as follies, and yet the engineering profession has been dragged into this project of developing weapons for the sake of essentially an imperialist adventure, the sake of projecting foreign policy at home. So we're foreign power abroad, where people might think of themselves as working to defend their nation, with admirable motivations, working to defend their nation against foreign threat. Actually, that's not what's been happening. It's actually been about projecting force abroad. And you might want to think about whether that's something you want to become complicit with. The other thing to say about those wars, but also about military funding in general, is just what a profound waste of resources it is. And again, if you think about what's the real threat to people in wealthy industrialised nations today, it's not Al-Qaeda, it's not Iran, it's not China, it's probably climate change or resource depletion. And having large chunk of the engineering profession working on military robotics is not doing anything about those problems. So let me say a little bit now about what I take to be what goes through the back of people's minds when they do accept military funding. And I want to make it clear here that The solution to the problem of engineers working for the military is not necessarily going to be individual engineers making an individual decision not to do it. I think that's important, but the real tragedy here is the way in which research is funded, the limited